Some of the darkest crimes in American history weren't committed by strangers in the shadows, but by women hiding in plain sight. From trusted nurses to loving mothers, their stories challenge everything we think we know. Subscribe now, because what comes next will leave you questioning everything. Karla Faye Tucker. It was the early morning of June 13, 1983, in Houston, Texas, when police were called to a second-floor apartment above a furniture store. Inside, they found two people, Jerry Lynn Dean and Deborah Thornton, lying motionless in a pool of blood. The scene was brutal. Both had been attacked with a pickaxe. Deborah's face was barely recognizable. The attack was not quick. It was frenzied. And what shocked investigators most was that one of the attackers was a 23-year-old woman named Karla Faye Tucker. To those who met her on the streets, Karla was tough, defiant, and reckless. But she hadn't always been. She'd grown up in a broken home, the youngest of three daughters. Her father left when she was young. Her mother introduced her to drugs before she was even a teenager. By 14, Karla was using heroin. By 16, she was working in the sex industry. The path that led her to the murders was littered with addiction, violence, and volatility. That night in June, Karla and her boyfriend, Daniel Garrett, broke into Jerry Dean's apartment to steal motorcycle parts. But Jerry was there. So was Deborah, a woman Karla didn't even know. What happened next would haunt everyone involved. According to her confession, Karla attacked Jerry first, striking him repeatedly with a pickaxe. When Deborah tried to hide behind a dresser, Karla found her too. She claimed she felt a surge of power with every blow. At her trial, those words would come back to define her. She was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death in 1984. Daniel Garrett received the same. But something happened in prison that complicated the story. Over the next decade, Karla Faye Tucker changed. She became sober. She became deeply religious. She spoke about guilt, redemption, and peace. She counseled other inmates. Her transformation drew attention from prison staff, pastors, journalists, even the public. When her execution date was set in 1998, a global campaign began to spare her life. Politicians, religious leaders, and even some victims' family members pleaded for clemency. They argued she was no longer the same person, that if the justice system believed in rehabilitation, Karla Faye Tucker was the proof. But the courts held firm. The sentence would stand. On February the 3rd, 1998, Karla was executed by lethal injection. She was the first woman executed in Texas since 1863, and the first woman in the United States executed since 1984. Her final words were filled with love and forgiveness. She looked toward the victim's family and said, "I hope God will give you peace with this." Her story still divides people. Some saw redemption, others saw manipulation. Some believed her death was justice, others believed it was unnecessary. But beneath all that debate was a quiet truth. Karla Faye Tucker left behind a legacy that forced America to confront a question it rarely asks. Can someone be both a killer and truly changed? Truly. Lizzie Borden. On the morning of August 4th, 1892, in Fall River, Massachusetts, a maid named Bridget Sullivan ran from the Borden household in a panic. Inside, 70-year-old Andrew Borden was found lying on the sitting room couch, his face nearly unrecognizable. Upstairs, his wife Abby lay face down in the guest bedroom, her skull fractured and her blood seeping into the carpet. Both had been struck multiple times with a sharp instrument, believed to be a hatchet. Within hours, suspicion fell on a woman who until then had lived a quiet and respectable life. Her name was Lizzie Borden. To the townspeople, Lizzie was a Sunday school teacher, the daughter of a wealthy businessman, and an unmarried woman in her early 30s who still lived at home. She was well-dressed, well-mannered, and deeply involved in her church. Her family wasn't affectionate, but they were known. Her father, Andrew, had built his fortune in real estate. He was frugal, even harsh, but he was powerful. Lizzie had a complicated relationship with both her father and her stepmother. She rarely spoke to Abby, referring to her only as Mrs. Borden. Tension in the household had been brewing for months, especially after Andrew began giving away property to Abby's relatives. Lizzie and her older sister Emma resented it. They felt their inheritance slipping away. The day before the murders, Lizzie was seen arguing with her father, and on the day itself, her story shifted. She claimed to have been in the barn during the attacks, but no footprints were found. A neighbor testified that Lizzie burned a dress days later. Police never found a murder weapon with blood, but a hatchet with a broken handle was discovered in the basement. Still, there was no physical evidence, no confession, and in a courtroom packed with journalists, Lizzie sat calm, composed, and stoic. Her trial captivated the nation. The prosecutee painted her as a calculating woman driven by greed and resentment. The defense argued there was no way a proper woman like Lizzie could commit such a gruesome act. They reminded the jury of her church work, her family reputation, her composure. After a 2-week trial, the jury deliberated for just 90 minutes. Lizzie Borden was acquitted. She walked free, but she was never free of suspicion. For the rest of her life, Lizzie remained in Fall River, living in a large home she named Maplecroft, isolated and watched. Children sang rhymes about her in the streets. Neighbors crossed the road to avoid her. She died in 1927, still denying any involvement in the murders. More than a century later, the Borden case remains one of the most enduring mysteries in American true crime. Was Lizzie a victim of circumstantial judgment or a woman who used society's blind spots to hide something darker? The truth, like the bloodstains in that house, was carefully cleaned but never fully erased. Velma Barfield. On October 3, 1978, in a quiet rural home in North Carolina, Jennings Barfield sat down for dinner. Hours later, he was vomiting violently and could barely speak. By the next morning, he was gone. His wife, Velma, appeared distraught. She told doctors he must have died from complications related to his ongoing illness. It seemed tragic, but not suspicious. Jennings had been ailing for weeks. What no one realized, at least not yet, was that his death was the final chapter in a much darker pattern. Velma Barfield wasn't just grieving, she was orchestrating. To those who knew her, Velma was gentle, well-liked, and deeply religious. She attended church regularly, wrote poetry, and wore the pain of her difficult life like a badge. A devout Southern woman who quoted scripture and carried herself with humility. People trusted her, and perhaps more dangerously, they pitied her. Velma had been married before. Her first husband died in a house fire. The second, Jennings, died after only a few months of marriage. But between those two lives were others. An elderly man she cared for, his wife, her own mother, all of whom died under sudden and puzzling conditions. And all of them had one thing in common. Velma had been the last to see them alive. When investigators finally looked deeper into Jennings's death, they found arsenic in his system, traces of it in his food, enough to be fatal. And then, like dominoes, the other deaths began to collapse into place. Exhumations were ordered. Each revealed the same signature: poison. Velma eventually confessed to 6 poisonings. Some were family, others were patients she cared for while working as a caregiver. The motive, she claimed, was never hatred but desperation. She had developed a severe addiction to prescription drugs and often stole money from her victims to support her habit. When they confronted her, she silenced them. Her trial began in 1978. The prosecution painted her as cold and calculating. The defense argued that her drug addiction had clouded her judgment, that she was a woman spiraling under untreated mental illness and trauma. Velma's life had been marked by abuse, grief, and dependency, But the jury wasn't convinced it justified 6 deaths. She was sentenced to death. In the years that followed, Velma became a different figure. While on death row, she counseled other inmates, corresponded with spiritual leaders, and expressed remorse for her actions. Even some of her guards believed her transformation was genuine, but appeals were denied. On November 2, 1984, Velma Barfield was executed by lethal injection. She was the first woman put to death in the United States after the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. Her story lingers in a moral gray zone, part serial killer, part tragic figure, a woman who used trust and faith as both armor and weapon, and whose final chapter forced the country to ask, can redemption ever outweigh the weight of the lives already lost? Aileen Wuornos. On December 13, 1989, a deputy in Volusia County, Florida, discovered the body of a man deep in a wooded area. He had been shot multiple times, left beside a quiet stretch of highway. The victim was 51-year-old Richard Mallory, an electronics store owner. At first, police assumed it was a robbery gone wrong. Florida wasn't unfamiliar with roadside crimes, but over the next 12 months, 6 more men would be found in similar conditions. Each one had met a woman before they died. Her name was Aileen Wuornos. To the public, Aileen was easy to overlook, rough around the edges, a drifter. She lived in motels and truck stops, made money through sex work, and often traveled with her partner, a young woman named Tyria Moore. Most people saw her as just another face among the forgotten, but beneath that exterior was a storm that had been building for decades. Aileen claimed the men she shot had tried to harm her, that each act was self-defense. She said Richard Mallory had assaulted her and she feared for her life. When the other victims were found, Charles Carskadden, David Spears, Peter Seams, Troy Burris, Charles Humphreys, and Walter Gino Antonio, her narrative stayed the same. She didn't see herself as a killer. She saw herself as a woman fighting to survive. But the evidence told a more complicated story. The men were strangers. Some had no history of violence. In fact, one was a retired police officer. Another was a part-time missionary. Aileen had pawned items belonging to the victims. Their cars were found abandoned, some wiped clean. Her fingerprints matched shell casings at the scenes. The pattern was deliberate and difficult to ignore. When police finally caught her in early 1991, it was her partner Tyria who agreed to cooperate. In recorded calls, Aileen assured Tyria she would take the blame, and she did. She confessed to the murders, sometimes with cold detachment, other times with bitterness. She insisted she was not evil. She said the world had always been cruel to her, and she was just pushing back. Aileen's past revealed years of abandonment, childhood abuse, and life on the streets. She was homeless at 13, arrested repeatedly. Her life had been survival on the edge, but her actions, calculated, repeated, fatal, left 7 families grieving. She was convicted and sentenced to death. In 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. Her final words were cryptic. "I'll be back, like Independence Day, with Jesus, June 6th. Her case sparked national debate. Was she a monster or a damaged woman failed by the system? Some saw her as a symptom of a world that chewed her up. Others saw her as exactly what she denied, a serial killer hiding behind victimhood. In the end, Aileen Wuornos left behind more questions than answers. A woman shaped by trauma, driven by something no one could fully understand. And in that space between guilt and survival, she became something America had rarely seen before. Its first female serial killer on death row, Andrea Yates. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, in a quiet suburb of Houston, Texas, a call came in to 911. The voice on the line was calm, flat, and chilling. Andrea Yates told the operator she had just drowned her children. all 5 of them. When first responders arrived at the small brick home on Beachcomber Lane, they found the youngest child, 6-month-old Mary, still floating in the bathtub. 4 others, John, Paul, Luke, and Noah, were laid out on a bed, soaked and lifeless. The oldest, Noah, was 7 years old. Andrea Yates sat nearby, wet and expressionless. She didn't run, she didn't resist, she simply waited for police to arrive. To the outside world, Andrea appeared like any suburban mother. She had been a registered nurse before leaving the workforce to raise her children full-time. She was quiet, intelligent, devoutly religious. Her husband, Rusty, worked as a NASA engineer. They lived modestly, homeschooled their children, and rarely drew attention to themselves. But what unfolded inside that home over the years was something far more fragile and complicated than anyone realized. Andrea had long struggled with mental illness, postpartum depression, psychosis, and deep feelings of inadequacy. After the birth of her 4th child, she had suffered a complete breakdown. She was hospitalized multiple times. Doctors prescribed antipsychotic medication. She was diagnosed with severe postpartum psychosis. Still, the births continued, and so did the symptoms. In the months leading up to the tragedy, her mental health declined rapidly. She became withdrawn, delusional. She stopped speaking. At one point, she was found pacing in circles. Her psychiatrist later testified that Andrea had told them she was hearing voices, that she believed her children were not right with God and would be damned if they lived. The day of the drownings, Rusty had only left for work a short time earlier. Her mother-in-law was scheduled to arrive an hour later. In that narrow window, Andrea filled the bathtub. One by one, she brought her children into the bathroom and held them under the water. At her trial, Andrea Yates pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecution argued that she was aware of what she was doing and tried to conceal it, an act of premeditation. But the defense laid bare years of medical records, psychiatric evaluations, and signs of psychosis that had been overlooked or minimized. Initially, she was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, but in a rare turn, the verdict was overturned. In 2006, a second trial declared her not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to a high-security mental health facility where she remains to this day. Andrea's case forced America to confront something we often avoid: the terrifying intersection of motherhood and untreated mental illness. It was not a crime of hatred or revenge. It was the result of a mind that had quietly and completely fractured. And for many, that truth is far more unsettling than any headline. Susan Smith. On October 25, 1994, a tearful young mother stood before television cameras in Union, South Carolina. Her name was Susan Smith, and she claimed that a stranger had carjacked her vehicle with her 2 young sons, Michael and Alex, still strapped in their car seats. The story was horrifying. Susan said a man had approached her at a red light, brandished a weapon, and taken off with her car and her children. Over the following days, a nationwide manhunt began. Roadblocks were set up, helicopters searched the woods, candlelight vigils were held across the state. Susan made daily appearances on the news, pleading with the alleged kidnapper. She begged for her children's return, sobbing into microphones, asking, "Please bring them back. They're all I have." But behind the grief was something quietly unraveling. At just 23 years old, Susan Smith was seen as a devoted mother, navigating a difficult divorce. She came from a conservative, small-town background. She worked a modest job and was known for keeping to herself, but there were fractures in the image. Her marriage had been volatile. She was reportedly involved with a local businessman's son, someone who, by his own admission, had made it clear he didn't want children. 9 days into the investigation, Susan's story changed. She confessed. There had been no carjacking. On that night, she had driven her car to a nearby lake. With her son still in the back seat, she released the parking brake and watched the vehicle sink into the dark water. She later said she stood there for moments afterward, watching until it disappeared beneath the surface. When divers pulled the car from the lake, the boys were still strapped in. Their small bodies were still wearing pajamas. Investigators and the public were left stunned. Why would a mother stage such a horrifying lie? What could possibly justify the unthinkable? Susan's defense team revealed years of trauma, childhood abuse, mental health struggles. They painted a portrait of a young woman spiraling, desperate for affection, afraid of abandonment, and mentally unstable. The prosecution, however, pointed to a letter Susan had received from the man she'd been seeing, one in which he ended their relationship, citing her children as the reason. They argued it wasn't just desperation, it was calculated. In 1995, Susan Smith was convicted on 2 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. She remains incarcerated. The image of her standing in front of cameras, pleading for children she knew were already gone, still haunts many who watched the case unfold. It raised uncomfortable questions about maternal instinct, mental illness, and the performative face of grief. In the end, Susan Smith wasn't just a mother who lost her children, she was the one who drove them into the silence, and in doing so, left a nation asking whether the truth was buried not in the lake, but in the way we overlook quiet signs until it's too late. Diane Downs. On the night of May 19, 1983, a red Nissan Pulsar came screeching into the emergency bay of Mackenzie Willamette Hospital in Springfield, Oregon. Behind the wheel was a woman named Diane Downs. Her 3 young children were in the back seat, covered in blood. Diane told hospital staff a horrifying story that a stranger had flagged her down on a rural road, demanded her car, and opened fire when she refused. But within hours, doctors noticed something off. Diane had a single gunshot wound, clean, superficial, while her children had been critically injured at close range. One of them, 7-year-old Cheryl, was already gone. To the outside world, Diane Downs had seemed like a caring, devoted single mother. She worked for the U.S. Postal Service, wore a constant smile, and often spoke of her kids as her entire world. But behind the image was a much different reality. Friends described her as unpredictable. Co-workers remembered her talking more about her love life than her family. Her ex-husband had walked away, citing chaos and instability. The 2 surviving children, Danny and Christy, were barely clinging to life. Doctors fought to stabilize them, not knowing that these small, broken bodies might one day tell the truth. As investigators began to piece together Diane's timeline, inconsistencies piled up. Her story about the stranger didn't align with tire tracks at the scene. There was no evidence of an attempted carjacking. A search of her home revealed diaries filled with longing for a married man she'd been having an affair with, someone who had made it clear he didn't want children. Then, weeks later, came the quiet turning point. Christy, barely able to speak after her traumatic injury, was asked who had shot her. She whispered one word, "Mom." The case cracked wide open. Ballistic evidence confirmed that the bullets came from a weapon linked to Diane. Witnesses reported seeing her driving slowly near the crime scene, not in the panic she claimed. The motive became disturbingly clear. She wanted to be free of her children, to win back the man who had left her. In 1984, Diane Downs stood trial for murder, attempted murder, and assault. She took the stand in her own defense, smiling, gesturing casually, as though detached from the gravity of her own story. The jury took just 36 hours to convict her. She was sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years. Later, while incarcerated, she gave birth to another child, fathered by a man she met during the investigation. That daughter was quietly adopted and raised far from the media glare, learning years later who her biological mother was. The case of Diane Downs is not just one of violence. It's about the betrayal of the deepest trust, between a mother and her children. The question that lingers is not how she did it, but how she could. Because sometimes the most chilling stories don't come from strangers, they come from the person who said they loved you most. Casey Anthony. On July 15, 2008, a call came in to 911 dispatchers in Orange County, Florida. A woman named Cindy Anthony reported her 2-year-old granddaughter Kaylee had been missing for 31 days. Her daughter Casey had not mentioned it until that night. When officers arrived, Casey's explanation was vague. She said her nanny had taken the child and vanished. But there was no nanny by that name. The story didn't add up. And soon, investigators began peeling back the layers. Casey Anthony was 22 years old at the time. To many, she seemed like an ordinary young mother, living with her parents, occasionally working, often seen smiling in photos with her child. Kaylee was described as bright, curious, and happy, but behind the family's suburban image was growing tension. Friends later testified that Casey had been out partying in the weeks after Kaylee disappeared. Photos surfaced of her at nightclubs, and despite her daughter being gone, she hadn't told a soul. Months passed. Then, on December 11, 2008, a meter reader discovered something in a wooded area less than a mile from the Anthony home, a bag containing the skeletal remains of a child. The body had been there for some time, wrapped in a blanket with duct tape nearby. The remains were identified as Kaylee Anthony. The public reaction was swift and furious. Casey was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors painted a chilling picture that Casey wanted freedom from motherhood, that Kaylee had been in the way. They pointed to computer searches made for chloroform and neck breaking, and the smell of decomposition reported from Casey's abandoned car. But Casey's defense told a different story, one of a dysfunctional family and deep trauma. They claimed Kaylee had accidentally drowned in the family pool, that Casey panicked and her father, a former police officer, helped cover it up. They argued that her lies were a result of years of abuse and emotional manipulation. In 2011, the trial began. Cameras broadcast every moment. The prosecution's case was circumstantial. No cause of death had ever been confirmed. And when the verdict was read, it shocked the nation. Not guilty of murder. Casey Anthony walked free, but her image never recovered. Many believed justice had not been served. Her silence during the search, her behavior, her shifting stories, all of it left an uncomfortable void, not just about what happened to Kaylee, but who Casey truly was. Even now, over a decade later, her name sparks debate. Was she a mother overwhelmed and traumatized, or something far more calculated? The truth, if it exists, may never be known. But what lingers most is Kaylee's absence. A child full of life whose voice was lost in a storm of lies, trials, and speculation. And a case that reminds us that sometimes the answers we seek don't come with verdicts. They come with silence. Jeanine Jones. In 1981, staff at a small-town hospital in Kerrville, Texas, began to notice a disturbing pattern. Infants in the pediatric unit, many of them recovering well, were suddenly crashing without warning. Some died, others suffered permanent damage. There were no clear causes, but one detail kept repeating. Jeanine Jones was often the last nurse on shift. To the public, Jeanine seemed devoted. She was in her early 30s, short and energetic, known for her no-nonsense attitude and tireless work ethic. Parents often thanked her for her dedication. She stayed late. She didn't shy away from critical patients. She presented herself as someone who truly cared. But behind that commitment, something else was unfolding. Colleagues began to quietly express concern. There were too many emergencies. Too many infants going into sudden cardiac arrest, too many resuscitations required when Jeanine was present. She developed a reputation not just for being involved in critical cases, but for creating them. Janine left Kerrville under quiet circumstances, never formally disciplined. She then took a new job at the Bexar County Hospital in San Antonio, working at a pediatric clinic, and within months the same pattern emerged. One of her patients, 15-month-old Chelsea McClellan, was brought in for a routine vaccination. Hours later, Chelsea was dead. Janine had administered the injection. Later, it was discovered that the syringe contained succinylcholine, a drug that paralyzes muscles, including the ones that control breathing. It had no medical purpose in the context of a healthy child. Investigators soon launched a full-scale review of her work. They found irregularities, missing records, and unexplained deaths. Over time, suspicions grew that Janine had harmed and possibly killed dozens of children, not out of hatred, but seemingly to create emergencies she could then save, earning praise and attention. When resuscitation failed, she remained oddly calm. Prosecutors focused on Chelsea's death and one other case where the drug was traceable. In 1984, Janine Jones was convicted of murder and injury to a child. She was sentenced to 99 years in prison, but the story didn't end there. Due to a legal loophole meant to reduce prison overcrowding, she was eligible for early release, despite being suspected in over 40 deaths. To prevent that, prosecutors filed new charges in 2017 related to additional victims whose cases had been quietly preserved for decades. In 2020, Janine pleaded guilty to more charges and received a life sentence. To this day, the full number of lives lost may never be known. Janine Jones wasn't a killer who lurked in the shadows. She worked in brightly lit rooms, wore scrubs, and smiled at grieving parents. She didn't hide behind violence. She hid behind care. And that may be what makes her story so deeply unsettling. Because she chose victims who couldn't speak, families who trusted her, and a profession built on healing, not harm. And in that trust she found a cover no one thought to question until it was far too late. Mary Winkler. On the morning of March 22, 2006, police in Selmer, Tennessee, received a disturbing call. Inside the modest home of a local pastor, Matthew Winkler, authorities found his lifeless body sprawled on the bedroom floor. He had been shot in the back with a 12-gauge shotgun. What caught investigators off guard was not just the violence of the scene, but who was missing. His wife, Mary Winkler, and their 3 young daughters were gone. To the outside world, Mary was the portrait of a Southern preacher's wife, soft-spoken, polite, deeply involved in church activities. She sang in the choir, taught Sunday school, raised 3 children, and faithfully stood by her husband, Matthew, a well-respected pastor at 4th Street Church of Christ. They were seen as a model family, warm, devout, untouched by scandal. But that illusion began to unravel 24 hours later. Mary was found hundreds of miles away in Orange Beach, Alabama, sitting quietly in a hotel room with her daughters. When questioned, she didn't run, she didn't deny. She told police in a calm, almost hollow voice, "I just couldn't take it anymore." What followed was a story far more complex than anyone expected. Mary confessed to pulling the trigger while Matthew slept. She said she didn't plan it, that it was a moment of emotional collapse. For years she described feeling dominated and degraded, financially, emotionally, and spiritually. She told the court about humiliation over money problems, verbal control, and demands that stripped her of self-worth. The trigger, she said, was a confrontation the night before over a fraudulent financial scheme she had gotten involved in, out of desperation, she claimed, to fix their mounting debt. In her own words, it wasn't hatred, it was exhaustion, a psychological breaking point. The courtroom wrestled with a haunting question. Was this an act of cold calculation, or the desperate act of a woman quietly suffocating under years of pressure? Mary was convicted, not of murder but of manslaughter. The jury acknowledged something many had a hard time accepting, that behind the smile and Sunday dresses, Mary was collapsing inside. She served just 7 months in prison, and the case sparked heated national debate. Some saw her as a manipulative killer who tried to rewrite her story. Others saw her as a woman abandoned by the system, living in the shadows of a man she no longer recognized. And that's what lingers most, the silence. The silence of a wife in a pew every Sunday, hiding the weight of her private despair. The silence of a marriage that looked perfect on the outside, yet unraveled in the most tragic way. Mary Winkler's case wasn't about one shot fired in the night. It was about everything that came before, and everything that couldn't be said until it was far too late. Martha Beck, February 28, 1949, Michigan. Police were called to a quiet home in Grand Rapids after neighbors reported hearing frantic cries. What they found was not just a scene of violence, but a window into a much larger web of deception, manipulation, and death. Inside lay the body of a local woman named Delphine Downing. Nearby, her 2-year-old daughter was found lifeless as well. At first it seemed senseless, until investigators looked closer at the couple staying with them, a man named Raymond Fernandez and a woman who called herself his sister. Her name was Martha Beck. To the outside world, Martha was unremarkable. A former nurse, a single mother of 2, and a woman who had struggled for most of her life with rejection, loneliness, and physical insecurities. She was intelligent, yet deeply insecure. Someone who craved connection, even at a cost. When she met Raymond through a personal ad, something changed. Her longing for love became an obsession. And Raymond, he saw in Martha not just a partner, but an accomplice. The victims came from across the country, women who placed Lonely Hearts ads in newspapers hoping to meet someone honest. Instead, they met Raymond, and wherever he went, Martha followed, posing as his sister or housekeeper. Together, they exploited these women financially, and in several tragic cases, ended their lives. Delphine Downing was one of them. After growing suspicious, she threatened to go to the police. That night, Martha gave Delphine sleeping pills, and Raymond later took her life. When the toddler began crying, Martha silenced her permanently, not out of rage, but as she later said, to protect Raymond. The investigation would reveal a trail of at least 3 confirmed murders, with more suspected. The pair had traveled from New York to Michigan, leaving behind confusion, empty bank accounts, and grieving families. But the most haunting part was Martha herself, not detached or coerced, but deeply, obsessively loyal. She believed she had finally found someone who loved her, and she would do anything to keep that love from slipping away. During their trial, Martha stunned the courtroom. She wasn't passive, she was articulate, even assertive. And when questioned about her crimes, she didn't deny them. She explained them as acts of loyalty, of love. Her words left jurors cold. Both she and Raymond were sentenced to death. On March 8, 1951, they were executed at Sing Sing Prison in New York, side by side, just as they had lived. Martha Beck's story isn't just about crime. It's about emotional hunger so profound it blinds reason, about a woman who felt so unworthy of love, she chose destruction over solitude, and about how dangerous love becomes when it's tied not to compassion, but control. Judy Buenoano, March 27, 1983, Pensacola, Florida. A quiet stretch of road near the bay turned into a scene of confusion and panic. Judy Buenoano sat in her car, smoke rising behind her. A bomb had detonated under the driver's seat, intended for her partner, John Gentry. Miraculously, he survived, but what investigators uncovered afterward would unravel over a decade of deception, staged accidents, and death. Judy appeared like many hard-working women of her time, a licensed nurse, composed, private. Neighbors called her polite, devoted to her family, No one suspected that behind her soft-spoken demeanor was someone willing to harm the people closest to her, for money. Her first husband, James Goodyear, a U.S. Air Force sergeant, died mysteriously in 1971, just months after returning home from deployment. His death was ruled natural. Judy collected life insurance. Years later, her son Michael became ill. Weakness, paralysis. Doctors were baffled. He died after a tragic canoe accident in a river, his body weighted down. But autopsy results later showed he had been slowly poisoned with arsenic. She'd taken out insurance policies on him too. Then came Bobby Joe Morris, a boyfriend in Colorado who collapsed and died in 1978. Once again, insurance payments followed. Each death seemed unrelated, different states, different methods. But the financial motive remained consistent. The bombing in Pensacola changed everything. John Gentry, her then partner, had noticed inconsistencies. Judy had convinced him to start taking vitamins, which made him ill. When the car exploded, investigators took a second look at her past. Autopsies were reordered, poison traces were found, insurance policies reviewed. A pattern emerged, one Judy could no longer explain away. She was calm during questioning, almost detached, not panicked, not confused, just matter of fact. That unsettling composure became her signature, even during trial. The media dubbed her the Black Widow, but the nickname barely captured the cold precision of her actions. In 1984, she was convicted for the murder of her son, and later for the attempted murder of John Gentry. Additional convictions followed for earlier deaths. Each sentence confirmed what prosecutors suspected. This wasn't impulsive. It was systematic. Judy Buenoano was executed in 1998, Florida's first female execution in 150 years. She walked to the electric chair without emotion, declining to give a final statement. No apology, no defense, just silence. What makes this case so haunting isn't only the crimes, it's how long she concealed them, how ordinary she appeared, how easily she exploited trust. Judy wasn't driven by passion or vengeance, just profit. And that cold clarity wrapped in a mother's image is what makes her story so deeply disturbing. Pamela Smar. It was May 1st, 1990, in the quiet town of Derry, New Hampshire. Police responded to a call from a panicked young woman. Her husband had been found shot in the head inside their condominium. His name was Gregory Smart. He was just 24. At first glance, it looked like a robbery gone wrong. The apartment had been ransacked, and Greg's wallet was missing, but something about the scene didn't sit right with investigators. There were no signs of forced entry. No one had heard a break-in. And the woman who reported it, Greg's wife, Pamela, was unusually composed. Pamela Smart was 22 at the time. She worked as a media coordinator at a local high school, young, articulate, ambitious. Outwardly, she was the picture of stability, married, professional, and seemingly devoted to her job. But beneath the surface, something darker had been unfolding. Greg and Pam had only been married a year. Friends described them as mismatched. He was laid back, kind-hearted. She was driven, fixated on appearances. Behind closed doors, their relationship had begun to unravel. During her time at the school, Pamela had grown close to one of her students, 15-year-old Billy Flynn. By all accounts, she was the adult in the room. But according to court testimony, she began grooming Billy. What began as mentoring turned into flirtation, and by early 1990, the two were having a secret relationship. It didn't stop there. Pamela, prosecutors would later argue, convinced Billy that the only way for them to be together was to remove her husband. She couldn't divorce Greg, she allegedly said, because she'd lose everything, her image, her job, and the life she wanted. So Billy, along with 3 teenage friends, carried out the plan. On the night of the murder, Billy entered the Smart home with a handgun. He shot Greg in the head while one of the other boys waited outside. They staged the scene to look like a burglary. For weeks, Pamela played the grieving widow. She gave interviews, expressed shock, and insisted she wanted justice. But her story started to crumble. One of her conversations, recorded by a cooperating witness, caught her making vague but damning statements, enough for investigators to put the pieces together. In 1991, Pamela Smart was convicted of being an accomplice to first-degree murder, conspiracy, and witness tampering. She was sentenced to life without parole. Billy Flynn and his accomplices were tried as juveniles and eventually released. But the case didn't fade. It became one of the most sensational trials of the 1990s, raising questions about influence, manipulation, and adult responsibility. Pamela Smart has always denied ordering the murder. She claims she was in love, but never asked for Greg's death, and yet the evidence, especially the manipulation of a vulnerable teenager, painted a chilling picture. At its core, this was a crime shaped not by rage but by calculation, a woman who blurred the lines between power and intimacy, and a young boy caught in the fallout of adult betrayal. Belva Gaertner, March 11, 1924, Chicago, Illinois. In the front seat of a parked car, police found the lifeless body of a man, shot through the head. A bottle of gin lay near his feet, a .38 revolver beside him. The man's name was Walter Law, a married factory worker. The car belonged to a woman named Belva Gaertner. When police arrived at her apartment later that day, Belva was found slumped in a chair, intoxicated, her clothes stained with blood. She told them she had been drinking heavily the night before and remembered nothing. Nothing about the car, nothing about Walter, nothing about the gun. To the outside world, Belva was captivating. A cabaret singer, stylish, magnetic, and well-known in Chicago's jazz-age social circles. Divorced twice, she was living fast in a city teeming with crime, ambition, and reinvention. But behind the glamour, there was turbulence. Walter Law wasn't just a stranger. He was Belva's lover, a younger man. The two had a volatile, alcohol-fueled relationship marked by jealous arguments and public fights. Walter, despite having a wife and child, had become entangled in Belva's world, a world where passion and danger coexisted. On the night of his death, witnesses claimed they saw the couple together, drinking and arguing. Belva later admitted they'd gone driving. She said they fought, and that she'd walked home afterward. What happened in the car remained a mystery. At trial, prosecutors painted her as reckless, manipulative, and dangerous. They argued this was a crime of jealousy. Walter had threatened to leave, and Belva wouldn't allow it. But her defense was equally strategic. They said she was too drunk to remember what had happened, and too small to have pulled the trigger. The jury believed her. In June 1924, Belva Gaertner was acquitted of murder. She walked free, flashing a smile at reporters and thanking the system that had given her a second chance. Her case, along with another high-profile female trial that same year, became the inspiration for the character Velma Kelly in the musical Chicago, a woman who claimed innocence, played to the press, and beat the system. But the story doesn't end in court. Belva later remarried one of her ex-husbands, then divorced again. She eventually left the spotlight, her name fading into the footnotes of true crime history. Yet her case lingered for what it represented. A moment in time when charm, social standing, and gender shaped the outcomes of justice. Some say Belva got away with murder. Others say she was a casualty of her era, of hard living and harder choices. But one thing is clear, her story wasn't just about a crime. It was about power, image, and the stories we choose to believe. Juanita Spinelli, November 21, 1940, San Francisco, California. On that cold autumn night, police pulled a body from a shallow ditch outside the city. The victim was a teenage boy, his skull fractured, his neck broken, his body dumped like garbage. His name was Robert Sherrod, just 19 years old. At first, authorities suspected a robbery, but as they pulled at the threads, they found something much darker. This wasn't a random act. It was an execution, carefully ordered, not by a man, but by a woman named Juanita Spinelli. To outsiders, Juanita, often called the Duchess, seemed like just another middle-aged landlady. She ran a boarding house and kept mostly to herself. But beneath that plain exterior, Juanita was the mastermind behind a criminal gang, a woman who didn't just tolerate violence, she directed it. Her home became a sanctuary for outcasts, teenage runaways, young criminals, men with no place to go. But it wasn't charity. Juanita recruited these young men into her orbit, manipulated them, and trained them for petty theft, robbery, and eventually more serious crimes. She was older than all of them, but somehow she commanded absolute loyalty. Robert Sherrod was one of her recruits, but over time he became a problem. He knew too much, and he was starting to talk. Juanita couldn't allow that, so she did what few could imagine. She ordered his death and had her own gang carry it out. Robert was lured out of town under the pretense of a job. Then he was beaten and thrown into the river. The killing shocked the city, but what stunned investigators even more was who had orchestrated it. During interrogation, one of Juanita's boys broke. He described her not as a mother figure, but as a controlling force. A woman who manipulated with guilt, fear, and affection. She had created a world where betrayal was met with silence or death. In court, Juanita appeared unmoved. She was sad. She wore black, kept her answers short, and never expressed remorse. But jurors didn't need emotion. They had confessions, timelines, and motive. She was convicted of murder. In 1941, Juanita Spinelli became the first woman executed in California's gas chamber. The newspapers called her the Duchess of Death. Her story faded quickly, lost in the backdrop of World War II. But for those who studied her case, one truth remained chilling. Juanita never held the weapon. She never struck the blow. She led with words, and in the end, that was enough. A woman who built her own empire on the backs of broken youth, and then discarded them when they became inconvenient. In a time when women were expected to nurture, Juanita ruled with cold precision, and that contradiction, the image of a caregiver who became an architect of death, still unsettles the quiet corners of true crime history. These women weren't just killers, they were mothers, caregivers, daughters, trusted by everyone around them. Their crimes weren't random, they were rooted in obsession, control, fear, and sometimes complete delusion. If you've made it this far, we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Did you know about any of these cases before? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and stay tuned. There's always more hiding beneath the surface.